So let's welcome Brandon Sanderson, by the way.
Alright, so this is essentially just Meet Brandon Sanderson. That's what it's called, right?
Yeah, I was given a list of questions.
Oh, okay. Well then, I'll answer questions then.
And then,
that sounds good.
And then if you have something you also just want to...
I was just going to sit down and...
They have some questions too. Yeah.
So yeah.
You're supposed to ask a couple of these. This might be all of them. And
okay, if I sit down, can everyone but like you can see me if I sit down?
And if you actually think of better... I was giving this. If you think of better questions...
No, maybe I'll stand up for a little while so I'm tired. Alright.
Here they go.
Hit me.
Alright. Which parts of your own writing were inspired by Jordan's work, if any?
Oh, quite a few. One of the things I've often pointed out is that when I sat down to write my own books, well, my very first few books were very derivative. This is what happens most of the time when someone is writing it. You know, I had essentially, farm boy in the woods who goes on a quest, and I mean it was, yeah. As I got older and more mature and developed my writing style, I really looked at what had been done and what was done very well in fantasy, and often I would react against. I would say, okay, this ground has been covered really, really well by my favorite authors, Robert Jordan being the top of them. And so what can I do that plays to my strengths that is different? You can see, I mean, those who have read Mistborn can see that it's essentially a postmodern Wheel of Time sort of takeoff. I started with a, what if Rand lost the last battle? And that was the history of this world. And of course, if Rand lost the last battle, the pattern would end and everything would end. So it's not really, I mean, but the question was, what if the hero who had been foretold from prophecy for so long came along and then didn't do what he was supposed to? What if it did, the prophecies were wrong? What if that? And that was what the takeoff of this one was. And so you can say that my first series was a postmodern, that's one of our literary English major words, was essentially a reversal of what I had grown up reading. And it was really me trying to take another spin on the same concepts and turn them around 180 degrees. I would say that is extremely heavily influenced by the Wheel of Time.
Now, do you see that, and I'm sure there's some aspiring writers here, and I write some things too, and do you think it's completely beneficial to always be reading other people's work? Or at some point do you feel like there's too much of a tendency, like, okay, I'm going to always end up writing the same story if I am always influenced?
There's a worry there. I say reading widely is very, very helpful no matter what genre you're trying to write. Reading widely, if you're trying to write fantasy, probably the best stuff to read are actually nonfiction history works. But yesterday in one of my workshop panels, I made the comment that I soundly believe, which is that fantasy can do anything any other genre can do, plus it can have magic. So why not? But that means that if you want, you can learn, if you're writing fantasy, from any genre. You can go read, I say romantic fiction. Romance novels are kind of the low form of, there are higher forms of the same genre that people are writing, and they all get lumped together. There are very well plotted, very well written romances. People who generally write them like to call them romantic fiction rather than romance novels. But you can read really good examples of those and say, how can I build plots that, the only real definition of a romantic fiction or a romance is that a major plot arc has to do with, will these two characters that you want to fall in love? Will they or won't they? You can learn from that. Thrillers, the genre of thriller is the genre that is the fast-paced, action sequence literary genre. You can learn from that for a fantasy book. Any history book you read, you can steal from liberally to use in your fantasy. In fact, those of you, if you've read The Wheel of Time enough, you'll notice how much is being drawn from history and from mythology and folklore. A all of these things are things that I think you should be writing if you want to be a writer yourself. There is that danger of when you're writing something specifically, if you read too heavily one author, being influenced so that your style shifts unconsciously, which can be a danger if you're particularly a newer writer, but sometimes you can do it intentionally. I have read heavily in The Wheel of Time while I've been writing this book, because I don't mind if The Wheel of Time influences the way, but whatever you read will nudge your style a little bit. And if you're aware of what your style is, you can help let it nudge you the right direction. So I say read widely, and I really get annoyed by people famous authors whose names I will not name, who get up and say, oh, I don't write that fantasy crap, and I don't read that fantasy crap. Because that to me is like a brain surgeon getting up and saying, oh, I don't pay attention to what other brain surgeons are doing. I'm not reading their essays on how to be better brain surgeons. I'm not looking at what they're doing. I do my own thing. I don't want a brain surgeon who's not paying any attention to what other brain surgeons are doing. I don't want to read a fantasy writer who's not going and studying what the other members of the genre are doing and how they're innovating and how the genre is progressing. I feel that whatever you write, you should be able to add something to it. And to add something to it, generally what we do is we look at what people have done really well and we go one step further. It's this whole concept of shoulder of giants. And either you can read the body of work by these brilliant authors who have come before us and allow them to let you stand on their shoulders, or you can try and start all over, and then you better be taller than them on your own, otherwise it's just not going to work. Occasionally, people pull it off. One of the others who says, oh, I don't read fantasy, but managed to write really good fantasy was J.K. Rowling. I was very disappointed to read her essay. Pratchett had a very scathing response to her in the London Times, which is wonderful. But most of the time, people who don't do that end up writing what was written 30 years before and not doing a very good job of it. And the rest of us say, we've been there, we've done that. Robert Jordan did it 10 times better than you, so read Robert Jordan, learn how he did it, and then allow yourself to stand on his shoulders. And, I think it's perfectly legitimate to read widely in the genre and react to it and say, here's a hole that I don't think has been filled, or here is something that I can do that adds to the genre, or here is, look how wonderfully this person did this, can I take it 2 or 3 steps further?
You brought up the word innovation. I thought
Yeah.
was interesting. Can you give us some examples of what you think today's
I think I can.
innovating?
I can. I can speak more widely on fantasy. My reading of science fiction is not extensive enough that I feel I can add a lot to that genre, which is why I don't write in that genre, except for the occasional short story, which if you've read my occasional short story in science fiction, they are nothing spectacular. I think they are well written, but they're not taking the genre forward leaps and strides. They are kind of writing anyway. The fantasy genre, this is my armchair, because I wear several hats. One of my hats is as a scholar. I do have a master's degree in English, creative writing emphasis, but had to take a lot of lit classes. And armchair, one of my focuses and look at things that I've been very interested in is the fantasy genre. And if you look at the fantasy genre, there are these certain waves that happen based on what the dominant author is and how that author changes the genre. And the really first big one of these was Robert E. Howard, who came along and really influenced the genre. And there are others that are like him, but that was until the Tolkien era really came along, and Tolkien completely reimagined the genre. And that was kind of the 50s, the 60s. And the genre through the 70s, 72 I believe is the first time that a publisher said, wow, let's make an imprint that focuses only on fantasy, or that focuses a lot on fantasy. And that was Tom Doherty with Ace in 72, as I think the year of that. Don't quote me on that, but it was a fantasy and science fiction imprint where he went into it saying, I want to buy fantasy and that's targeted at adults. I want to do what Tolkien did, and what Robert E. Howard did, and find a way to make this genre. And that really, the 70s, particularly 78, when Lester Del Rey released sort of Shannara and the first Thomas Covenant book were both 78. So though you could see the 70s, what was happening in the 70s was people read Tolkien and said, wow, Tolkien was awesome, and Tolkien died. And now what do we do? And it's kind of like he was so ahead of his time that we spent a number of years trying to figure out what he did. And you see a lot of things that were very Tolkien derivative, in a good way. It's not that these people, that the authors were not, I mean, Thomas Covenant, what's his name? Donaldson is a genius. He's a brilliant writer. But he was taking off of the Tolkien-esque tradition, and it's very Tolkien-esque. And you've kind of got these two legs where you've got Brooks producing kind of younger themed Tolkien stuff, and you've got Donaldson producing older themed Tolkien sort of stuff. And you've got these two traditions splitting out of the epic tradition. And that really dominated the 80s. Very much dominated the 80s. On one side, on kind of the Terry Brooks side, you've got David Eddings that comes along and kind of does that same thing. And then on the other side, you've got people like Tad Williams who are coming along and what they're trying to do is reproduce something that feels like Tolkien. But it felt to me like when reading all this, people didn't quite know what Tolkien had done. And they were struggling and trying to figure it out.
The Dragon Bone chair?
Yeah. Then we hit 1990 and the release of Eye of the World. Which I feel was the next big revolution in this, and what Jordan got it right. He looked and said, this is what Tolkien did. There's a difference between copying Tolkien and saying, this is what Tolkien did, and using the same methods that Tolkien used, rather than just using the same world building that Tolkien used. And that, I think, is the mistake that people were making, was they were saying, well, to do what Tolkien did, we copy Tolkien's setting. Which what they need to do is say, what did Tolkien do? Tolkien went and looked seriously at the mythologies and created a new mythology. He wanted to create a new mythology that felt real and had the rigors of this realistic sort of thing going on. And I think Jim did that. And that was Eye of the World. And one of the interesting things about Eye of the World that the scholar Brandon looks at is it took Tolkien and it took some steps forward. Rather than a lot of people, it felt to me like were either standing just a little bit, or they were just essentially hovering in this doing what Tolkien did range and not quite managing it, where Jim said, let's go a few more steps. Jim added female characters, which Tolkien was, I mean, if there's a legitimate criticism against Tolkien, it's the girls don't do anything, except for Eowyn. So he added a more depth. And I feel that what Jim did, and this isn't to say that Jim was better than Tolkien, but Jim stood on Tolkien's shoulders, and for my generation, I feel created better fiction for us to read. I didn't like Tolkien when I first read him. I loved Eye of the World when I first read it, and I think what he did is he updated it, he took it steps forward. Instead of writing a world with elves and dwarves, he went back to the mythology himself and recreated this entire setting and things like this. And so really took the genre forward a few steps. And then on the other side, you have the Robert E. Howard folks still riding around. David Gemmell is in the Robert E. Howard tradition, taking that a few steps forward. And then George R. Martin hit the scene on that line of fantasy. And Martin is really taking a little bit of the epic, but it's mostly in this, what we call heroic fantasy, the Conan tradition, updated, just like Jim updated the Tolkien-esque epic tradition. And that's what kind of brought us into the 2000s. And even in the 2000s, I see the same thing happening with what happened to Tolkien, happening with Eye of the World. Meaning so many people are trying to figure out what Jim did, that they're doing it wrong. They're copying Jim rather than doing what Jim did. And so the late 90s and early 2000s were filled, I think, with these Eye of the World clones, which none of them were as successful as Eye of the World, because instead of reaching back and looking at this, trying to emulate Jim's methods, they were trying to emulate Jim's trappings. And because of that, there were some very high-profile flops in the fantasy genre about that time, and we started to epic. People started to leave epic for children's. because in children's, people were starting to innovate and doing a really good job. You had the Golden Compass coming out about that time. You had Garth Nix and Sabriel about that time, and some really brilliant children's authors doing some really innovative different things kind of ahead of the epic fantasy authors who were all still trying to do the same thing. So that brings us to 2000s. What do that's a big, long background to what I think, where I see the genre going. There's really still are, ever since this Howard and Tolkien kind of split and then mini split in the Eddings side, all of those people shifted over to young adult. That's where if Brooks and Eddings had been released nowadays, they would have been young adult. The young adult genre was not split off officially in bookstores until the late 90s in most places. And it was a wonderful thing, because before then, if you were a teen reader, you either had to go to the adult section and get lost trying to find something in the adult section that was targeted at you, or you had to go to the kids section, which no teenager wants to walk past those little gates with like the kiddie things at Barnes & Noble and says, welcome to the kids. And so they made a new section outside the kids section between kids and adults. Was a wonderful thing for the genres. I mean, there had been young adult librarians and things all before, but this is when the bookstores got on board. So anyway, that's kind of gone that way, and the new tradition for them are people like Aragon, or hopefully some better books like The Lightning Thief, and some of these things. But the epic tradition and the heroic tradition are still going strong in fantasy, kind of recovering from all these people trying to copy. And on the heroic tradition side, you've really got a lot of people who are saying, what Martin's big revolution was, gritty and real. Low fantasy, low magic. We're not dealing a lot with magic. People don't understand magic. If it exists, it's used very infrequently. And this is kind of the everybody dies and kills everybody else, but they're all kind of these shades of gray characters. And that's really big over there. And that's Joe Abercrombie. That's Liza Lockmore. Yeah, that guy. Lockmore. He's a good writer. He's a really good writer. I just can't remember his name. But all of this stuff going over here in epic, we've kind of struggled to find our feet, to figure out what it is. We haven't had a big epic hit since, unfortunately, Good Kind. I mean, and anyway, we haven't had something big break in epic fantasy since the mid-90s. And I think that's because of these high-profile flops, where a lot of the publishers said, oh, what people want to read is a story that's like Eye of the World. But the ones they bought did not do what Eye of the World did. So what do I think is happening? I think that readers are saying, we want to get the same feel that we got from these great epics that we read before, but we don't want to read the same story again. We don't want a blatant hero's journey shoved in our face at the beginning of every fantasy book. We loved it when it was new to us, but not every book has to start with, Eye of the World, yes, it started with Rand as a farm boy, quote unquote, as a sheep herder in the Two Rivers. That's not why, we're not reading still because that story ended in Eye of the World, and ever since then it's been something else. It's changed drastically since the books where Jim really got popular. He really exploded with Dragon Reborn and Shadow Rising, and that's digging much deeper into these things. And so whenever I see someone, I think that the readers are very tired of elves and dwarves, for one thing, and blatant hero's journeys. The hero's journey is not supposed to be a guidebook for writing a story. The hero's journey, Hero with a Thousand Faces, all these concepts, these are things that the scholars are saying, hey, when humankind creates stories, many times they follow these same patterns. But then when you try to take this and make it a pattern for writing a book, it's like a copy of a copy of a copy. And this is the problem we ran into with episodes 1, 2, and 3. Because Lucas loved the hero's journey, and he said, well, it has to have these parts. And he forced his story to, the virgin birth is part of the hero's journey. He said, I need a virgin birth. And it didn't fit his story at all. He put it in, he rammed it in there, and every audience member went, huh? What? That's not what you're, and when you're trying to force your story to fit these constraints, rather than telling a great story, you're running into trouble. The story should have some of these patterns to it, but that's only because you're writing from your heart, and you're writing, yeah. So anyway, what do I think fantasy is doing? Fantasy is moving strongly toward, on one side, low magic grittiness, which I don't really like that much, and on this side, high magic with innovative settings. Different sorts of fields and settings that are telling stories in places that you haven't read about. The sense of wonder. We read fantasy for sense of wonder, and if we have the same setting over and over again, the sense of wonder departs from us, I feel. And so that's where I think it's going. I may be wrong, but that's what I try to do in my fiction. Is I'm trying very hard to say I want a new, innovative setting that people sit down and read and say, I haven't read anything in a world like this before. I haven't read anything with a story like this before, and yet at the same time it gives me that same feeling that I got from the epic fantasies that I read in the 80s and 90s. In other words, I want to do the steps forward. I don't know if I can pull it off. But that's what the armchair scholar is saying, while the writer says, yeah, I'm wanting to tell a great story and just working on it and that. So, there you go. That's like a 20-minute answer.
It really was 20 minutes.
I'll throw some of these questions in.
We'll let Emma ask a question, but let's get through these first. And then we'll let Emma, we'll give some Emma time.
Not that you guys couldn't go before Emma. Yeah. So there's some questions here that are based, obviously, on bullet time.
Yep, let's do those. I'm happy to.
Before you began writing, because I know as a writer, as the writer of the series now, you can't say, well, I hate this character or whatever.
Right.
Before you began as a reader, did you dislike a character and wish that they weren't in the next book? Or
oh boy.
I know not now.
Yeah. We will preface this by saying whenever I'm in someone's head, they are the most important character.
Sure, right.
And I have loved writing all the characters. Boy, did Cat Swain annoy me. I understand completely who she is and why she does what she does, and when she's got to be on stage, I will be thinking like her. But there were several times I just wanted to smack that woman. So there you go. That's the way. She's awesome, but very, very frustrating.
Yes. Okay, that's a great answer.
I did not dislike Bielaczyc like everyone did. I don't know. I was annoyed by her in the ways when she was treating Karen like she was, but that's been books and books ago. She's grown a lot since then. And except for that one little blip of, Bielaczyc, you deserve what's coming to you. Other than that, I really, really like Bielaczyc. So I don't know,
I think, honestly, for those of us that, I'm not necessarily a hater of Bielaczyc, but I think, I look at Perrin and think if Bielaczyc was not, for some reason, died or something, he would freak out and go wolf, and I'd love to see him. So I would not mind to see him die. For sacrificing for the benefit of me as a reader.
Yes.
So here, another question is, how does it feel, and I don't know if this, I'm assuming this question was asked before, but how do you feel now that you've written 400,000? What is the sensation now compared to, a year and a half, 2 years?
I've written 400,000, and in part, I'm amazed that it actually turned out like it came out. Like that happens every time I write a book, when you look back and say, where did this come from? I can't believe that this actually works, this actually came together. And with this, it's even in a greater amount, because looking at this project before, it was so enormous and so daunting that I just couldn't, even, knowing that I was going to be writing it, it was hard to believe that I was going to be writing it. And looking back at what has been done, I think, thank goodness I don't have to do that again, because I don't know if I could recreate that, because it's, it's like you've just hiked up from the bottom of the Grand Canyon and looked down and said, I don't believe that I did that. Why am I not dead on the side of the road halfway up? I have hiked from the bottom to the top, and I should have been dead. Maybe some of you who are a little bit more in shape than me can just run that thing. But anyway, that's what it looks like. At the same time, I'm looking forward and saying, wow, I'm only a third of the way done. So it's still extremely daunting. I don't think I understood how big the project was because it was too big for me to even see. Now that I've taken a bite of it, I can feel how big this thing is in front of me. And yeah, so it's even more daunting, but extremely relieving that I've written something that I look at, and as a writer, oftentimes, if you've done something poorly, you can look at it and say, man, I need to rework that. There's something wrong with this. You get this kind of sick pit in your feeling. I have none of that for this book, which is so relieving that I can't even speak of, yeah, so there you go. Indescribable feelings attempted to be described.
Even knowing the end of the books at this point and being this far, is there an excitement that you still feel?
Oh yeah.
I can't wait to now.
I can't wait for
Find out
people
what
to
happens,
actually
you
be able
know.
to read this. That's the excitement. I can't wait for people to actually be able to read it because there's a part of me that's terrified. I'll definitely admit that. But there's also a part of me that says the readers will get this, and the vast majority of them will release a big sigh of relief saying, oh, thank goodness. It's not been ruined. Maybe I'll be wrong, but I'm thinking there'll be this huge, on November 3rd, you'll be able to feel the wind if you step outside of readers around the world saying, oh, thank goodness.
Is this the wind that came down from the mountain and around?
Yeah, the wind is watching us. But yeah, I'm really excited for people to say that because I do think a lot of people are going to have to say, you know what, I was wrong. They are treating this with respect. Now, like was said yesterday, I am not Jim, and I can't be Jim. But what I do think you're going to get is this book and read it and say, thank goodness. It's in good hands. This feels like the Wheel of Time, and this does not feel like, I'm not going to name any names, but it does not feel like author stepping in and just going someplace completely crazy, or book after book, hack them out, or it's going to feel like the next book in the series. And I think I'm excited for people to get that.
Have you begun writing down answers to questions you anticipate about disappointing fans? If you're like something like, this is what I'll say to
Yes, I have. The only thing for disappointed fans I'm really worried about, honestly, is I was so waiting for the scene and it wasn't in the book.
Right.
Those are the big ones that I know people are going to say because no matter what I chose, they were going to have that reaction because Jim had said a lot, and the books indicate a lot of what's going to happen in this final volume, and you just can't cover everyone. So I am waiting for I've heard some people say, oh, I can't wait to read about X, character X. And I know the character X doesn't appear in this version of the book, and I'm like, oh, I feel so bad. But every time someone has said character X, they have a major plot arc in the next one. Anyone who doesn't appear at all, there's only a couple characters who don't appear at all, have major plot arcs in the next one. And most people at least appear, so they'll be able to say, oh, okay, this is what happened. And then there are major steps forward and things that we know need to happen. And so I'm really hoping most people will read and say, wow, okay, I can see that everything is coming back together. But Jim we can say, since book 3, people have been going apart, really. Book 1, 2, and 3 were kind of everyone is heading the same directions, and then boom, and then book 11 went. Eh. Let's say book 11 was a turn back. So I have, that's 7 books of going away and 1 book of coming together, and I've got 3 books to do 6 books worth of bringing together, which I think is possible because there was a lot of drifting in some of these that I love. But I think with 3 books, you will read the book and you'll say, ah, it went like this. And the next one's like this. And then we've got, So I'm hoping that's what people will feel. We'll see. Next year, we'll see what you have to say.
So I don't understand this question, honestly, but
okay.
That's good. I'm assuming you would. Brandon, if you were a llama
Okay.
Which Amarillan would you spit on? A Leia or a Penguin and why?
What?
I have no idea.
Who would spit on Dwayne? I mean, yeah, when you've got a Leia to spit at. So yes, I would spit at Leia, and why? Because she's ruining everything. I have seen through Egwene's eyes as I've had to, and seeing Leia as Egwene sees Leia means lots of spitting. In a very dignified way.
Now, this one's more about your writing style, and again, I haven't heard this one.
How many more questions are there on
There's
there?
only like one or two.
Okay.
And then we'll jump into.
And then we'll do this. Okay.
Do you find you write in fits and starts as the mood strikes you, or do you have to kind of block out the time of the day and get down to it?
I am a slow but steady writer. Pioneer work ethic. You know, my families are, you know, pioneer stock. On one side of my family were lumberjacks. And that's what they did. My mom went up and lived in the forest with her family, away from electricity and indoor plumbing, every summer to cut down trees. And so that's that side. And then the other side are farmers, homesteaders in Idaho who, you know, raised potatoes for generations. And it's this. And so the artist cannot be forced every time. That anyone who is themselves an artist knows this. The artist sometimes just says no. But on those days when the artist says no, I write crap and throw it away. Because the pioneer says, no, you work. Even if that work, you know, working is important. And so I would say every day I write some. There are things that I've written even for, you know, for Gathering Storm that no one will see, that Alan and Maria and Harriet didn't see, because I wrote it and said, yeah, that's crap. And I knew I was writing it as I was going, saying, it's not flowing today, the art isn't working, but I'm going to force myself to write something, and then I'm going to toss it, because that act of getting through it often tells you the next day, as your subconscious works on it, oh, this is what I should have done. And there are several scenes in Gathering Storm which they did see that I knew weren't right, and I told them these aren't right, and in the latest version they got the new versions that when I was allowed to work on the problem for a while. There's one scene in the prologue in particular, I don't know if you know which one I'm referring to, but it had all sorts of problems, and then I tossed it and wrote an analogous scene that is much better. But that wouldn't have worked if I hadn't been working on it, hadn't approached this wrong a couple of times to then approach it right. So I'm a slow but steady writer.
So similar to the kind of, you mentioned yesterday, Robert Jordan was, or Jim was a kind of a write 12 drafts and then kind of final thing. Where do you end up in that spectrum?
Okay, Jim, that's something different, I think. I get a feeling that Jim just didn't want anyone to see his imperfect work.
Okay.
He was one of those artists who wanted to make it perfect, or at least as perfect as possible before he let anyone touch it, anyone else even experience it, which I don't have as much of a feeling for. I am more of a wide open writer, letting people see early drafts early. I mean, Warbreaker I posted as I wrote it, which I don't know if I'll ever do again, but because that's scary. I mean, you write a chapter and you are letting people see things before you've even gone back and done what we call the retroactive foreshadowing, where you finish a book and you're like, wow, that wasn't foreshadowed. And then you go back and you add it in so it looks like you knew all along. It makes you look really smart. They got to see all of it before things like that, which, yeah. I do that. So with Memory of Light, it's actually been hard not to share some of this stuff with people because I am kind of an open writer in this way. So we need a hi. We need it. Are you leaving? Oh yes.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course you can. Are you out of here?
I am.
Okay. Good seeing you. Yeah. Thanks for coming. Mm-hmm.
Thank you all. So I'm not going to ask that there's like one, but anyways, I think we should open it up and
Okay.
see what.
We will go ahead and let Emma first, and we'll go here. Okay.
Yeah, mostly in the word about the church.
Yep.
I'm worried The ending will get too predictable.
Okay. Her question is, she's worried that the ending will get too predictable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When some vision still has to come through or not.
Yep. I am worried about that myself. And Alan and Maria, Alan in particular has mentioned some things saying, let's back up on talking about this. When I was writing it the first time, I was trying to get it all in one book. And so there are certain things I foreshadowed pretty heavy-handedly because I knew it was going to get resolved very quickly in the same book, that fans wouldn't have a year between to speculate. Now that they're going to have a year between to speculate, we've actually changed a few things, which I can talk about after the whole series is out, to say, let's back off on this so that, and then we'll put it in the last book. I particularly don't think that this book, you're going to have to worry too much about that because really what's happening is these first two books of the three, my main goal is let's get everybody back. After all of this for so many books, we got to bring them back together because we know everybody's pointed at the same event, but everyone's in a different place. And those who have tried to pick out the chronologies know the chronologies, they're in a different place in time. When we end Night of Dreams, like I say, characters are weeks apart from each other. They're not happening coexistently. That you've seen things a month ahead of time for some characters and other characters and things like this. So one of my big goals is to get everyone back together. And so I don't think you're going to see very much of what happened. The after that is going to be the last one of the three. And I think we'll be okay. But we are worried about that too. And we're watching it and being careful with it. And I hope I don't make any mistakes in that and give too much away. But yeah, so there you go. It's a good question. I don't know if I can answer it, do it justice, but I'll try.
I was just wondering if you had any major problems to write this first part with like any type of writer's block, but it just took you a while to kind of get through.
No, I mean the occasional thing on a day that I just can't write, make it work. The biggest trouble was, and again I can say this after, say more afterward. There were certain characters which, when I tried to write their viewpoint, they just weren't feeling like themselves. And I had to take, there's a certain character I had to try 3 different times before I got them to start feeling right. And then there's another character that I was just so scared to write because I felt they were going to be really hard that I put it off and I put it off and I put it off. And then I tried it and it worked just fine. And so, and I can tell you more specifically later who they were because I don't want to give anything away. But that was more problematic, was for this book, getting the voices right. That was my #1 concern, was the characters got to feel like themselves. If I can get the characters to feel like themselves and follow the events that Jim laid out, then the book is going to be right, even if some of the trappings, some of the language, some of the way I write is different from the way that Jim wrote. The characters will feel like themselves, and it's going to be like a different director filming the same script, is what we hope it will be. And so if that director does their job right, the characters will still have the same actors, is what we want to do, even if the cinematography takes a few different angles and things like this. So yeah, I'm hoping it'll be like Terminator and T2, where you've got two, hopefully not even that different, but you know what I'm saying, or Alien and Aliens, and not Aliens to Alien 3. That's what I'm hoping. And there you go. So yeah. Of course, I think Alien and Aliens were the same director, weren't they?
No.
They both Ridley Scott. No, they were different. Yeah. Okay, so good. That's a great example. Okay, great. Here and then there.
Okay, I'd like to ask about naming characters.
Okay, yes.
First, I promised my mom I would verify that it's Elend and Sazed.
I say Elend, and I actually say Sazed.
Even when his nickname is Sazed?
Sazed.
Okay, so
Yep.
Sazed and it's just the first syllable.
Yep,
All right.
that's how I say them. But I maintain I'm a little bit different from Jim in this situation. I believe in writing as a participatory art, meaning when you read a book, you create your own version of that book. And in a way, every book exists in many times as people who read it, and you create a parallel dimension where people say the names the way you say them, and where the characters look like how you envision them. And that is yours, not mine. And I always say, you say it how you want to. Because to be perfectly honest, if we were to go to the world, if they really did exist, and we listened they would all speak in this wacky, weird language that none of us speak anyway, and the names wouldn't probably sound like anything we can pronounce, being from, you know, whatever countries, you know, America or Europe. I don't think there's anyone from not America or Europe here, that we are pronouncing them the way we do. So
that said, when you are when you're choosing the letters, at least that go into the names, either for your series or new characters that you're adding to what, how are other than drawing names out of a hat?
How am I doing it?
Night, yeah.
This has actually been something of struggle. This has actually been one of the harder things for Wheel of Time because Jim and I name very differently. Jim looks for names from mythology and changes them a little bit. That's his main way of doing it. I look for interesting linguistic tricks and approach it more in a little linguistics way. So for instance, I will do things like I did in Elantris, where I built a linguistic thing. Way of Kings is a better example. Symmetry is holy, has religious significance, and so names are built as palindromes. That's how I will do a name. I want my names to be cool-sounding palindromes. Or if someone does not feel they're holy enough, they'll have one letter different. And so they'll be like slant rhyme palindromes is what I'm looking for. Jim is doing this whole mythological thing, and I haven't quite been able to get my finger on how he does it. And so Alan and Maria will often have to say, this name is wrong, this doesn't fit the Wheel of Time. So.
What he also did, Jordan also did is just when he was looking around, saw a name.
Yeah, saw a name and change it,
It's not on his own.
Street names often and things like that. He did that a lot. And I don't do that. I'm looking for linguistic tricks. And so I've been trying to reconstruct it by saying, oh, all the people from Shi'enar have names like this. Do they? Well, they don't really. That's the problem. But I'm looking and saying, okay, this morpheme appears commonly, and trying to build names like that, and I'm getting it wrong too often at the time. And so it's one of the things I really want to work on. I think the names that we ended up with are good, but it took me several tries to get a lot of them. And even still, I think the names I came up with are serviceable, whereas the ones Jim came up with fit better. And so that's one thing I'll beg your indulgence on, is I'm still trying to get the names right and naming conventions right. I did go to his notes fairly often to pull names out, so it's liberally sprinkled with names he came up with. The ones I came up with just aren't as good. Sorry. I'm working on it. Alan.
I just have to throw this in, just to illustrate the wide variety of sources Jim used for names. This is my favorite, I have to say it. The Jen Aiel, remember them? Guess what their stovetop brand is? It could be anything. It could be anything.
I was wondering, there's actually a town called Malden in the Netherlands. Did Jim
Really?
know that? Or?
I don't know.
You very well could have, knowing how he did. Okay, right here, you had a question.
I'm going to preface this by saying I know you have your own methods and how you do stuff like that, but when you were given this massive amount of stuff, did you go and try and get into his head? Like, did you grab a sword and start chasing Harriet around?
The best way I felt to get in his head was to read the books again. When I would sit down to write, I would generally pick up a chapter out of Knife of Dreams, usually, sometimes Crossroads, from the same character's viewpoint, and just read and then try to start writing as if I were continuing that, even though it would be a different scene. But trying, and that was my big hope in keeping the same voices for the characters, was to try it like that. Wilson did give me that sword from Jim's collection, which, if you've seen on my website, if I've mentioned it before, is a black scabbarded katana, hand-painted with a gold and red dragon on it. So that's been hanging there for me to look at for inspiration when I need it. So that's around, so anyway. But no chasing Harriet with a sword. Yet. All right.
You mentioned on the panel yesterday, you made a passing comment about something about new viewpoints.
Yes.
Can we take that? Should we expect new viewpoints in the final 3 books? And if so, how do you approach writing a character where you have no example for their viewpoint?
Okay. I was very... The Wheel of Time has so many viewpoints already that in most cases, I felt it appropriate to just go back to what a viewpoint Jim had done. Generally, erring on the side of using viewpoints that had been, the more important the character, the more chance I was going to use them. So for the most part, I've been using Jim's viewpoints for just that reason, that it makes it easier, and plus, there's already so many people to keep track of, that why not use them? That said, there are in each book going to be a couple of new viewpoints. Most of them just for 1 or 2 scenes. The second book will have a larger new character, which will probably be the only book that'll have a new medium-ish type of major character as the outline stands right now. And that will probably be it. So the second of the 3, you can expect a new kind of pseudo-main character. But this is not the time to be adding in new main characters. I chose this one simply because there's an isolated place where we only have one viewpoint, and if there's going to be a major storyline, I like to be able to show a couple of different viewpoints. Plus, I kind of wanted to have one character that I could add to the mythology, and this was a very appropriate place for it. But everywhere else, if you're seeing a new viewpoint, it's there just because that they just get one scene or something like that. So don't expect me to be having a whole new set of main characters take over the books. That's not going to happen. All right, we'll go back here.
I apologize if you covered this already this weekend, but the way you are splitting the book,
yes.
The character stories,
yeah.
Are they meant to be sequential, or
okay.
is it in the Martin style where they'll just meet together later?
Jim actually really disliked how George cut his book. He actually told Harriet about how he thought that was a bad way to cut a book. And so when it was time, when they made the decision, when they said, we're thinking of cutting this, I said, let me give you some proposals, some options, which is the one I would choose, and then a couple of others in case you really dislike how I've chosen it. One of those options was the George R. R. Martin way, which was my least favorite of the options, but I felt I needed to present everything to Harriet. I came up with what I felt would make the best cut, and then I had a couple of other suggestions, and Harriet took what I felt would be the best cut. In fact, actually, I presented all those, and then I thought about it, and then I called her and said, I was wrong, I've got a better way, but it's going to make a bigger book. Because they were looking for cuts at the 250 mark, and I came up with one at the 300 mark that I felt was the better cut, and they went ahead and went with that.
Okay, so...
But I can't give too many specifics. I can say a couple things, though. What I did looking at it is I looked and said, okay, in the book is the full of Memory of Light kind of goes like this. Big, a lot of stuff, and then, you know, kind of back together, and then, of course, last battle, right? And I looked at it and said, I will cut this part into 2 books, and this part will be its own book. And this part right here, the reason I did that is because every character has an arc in this that are natural storylines. And I said, I'm going to take essentially 2 big chunks of, I saw about 4 big plot arcs, 4 to 5. I'm going to take 2 of those full plot arcs, and then I'm going to take little pieces of the other ones. And so we've got 2 major big plot lines going on, and then views of the other people setting up theirs. And then the next one, I'm going to do that. And so really, it's kind of looking like this. All right. If there were plots like this, let's say, if this isn't exactly their plots like this, what I decided to do was essentially do like that and like this. Does that make any sense?
Yes.
And I could do in this full plot arcs and then little denouements getting ready for this, because these characters had some things that needed to be cleared up before we get here. And then I could say the beginnings here, setting these ones up, and then do these full plot arcs in the next book. And so what's going to happen is it's not a completely parallel book, but there are going to be parallel scenes. Now, the only thing to remember in this, however, is that they are not happening parallelly at the end of Night of Dreams. And so it's really like you've had these long parallels like this, and Jim decided to do it like and I'm going like this, and the whole goal is that right here, everyone gets there at the same time, at the end of the second one. We'll see if we can pull that off. So there will be things that when we get to the second, that we will be jumping back in time for one of the big viewpoints things specifically. Then that character stuff is mentioned in the other one, and we will have to go back and see that character, but at the same time, the characters that were in book 1 will be continuing on. So it won't be just only jumping back and catching us up. We'll be continuing on here, catching this one up, and this one we've done half of, and we're going. And so, yeah, it's a little bit. It's really been tricky to juggle all of this and get it right. But I really feel that it's not gonna. The thing I want to avoid is the book 9-10 problem, because book 9 had all this powerful, important stuff. And then book 10 was what everyone else was doing, which is kind of more boring than what was happening over here. And we're getting to the end, like book 10 was, and I loved it as an author because it was very interesting intellectually to see what he'd done. But as a reader who waited years, what you saw was like 4 times covering the same ground again, and it felt like we weren't going anywhere. And I wanted to avoid that. As much as I liked that as an intellectual exercise, a lot of readers were like, hey, we didn't get any progress. That's what I want to avoid for the second book. I was really worried the second book would feel like that, so I had to save off some of the big, cool stuff for that one so that it would not just feel like that.
Yeah, we have about 10 more minutes,
okay.
And I have a quick viewpoint question.
Yes, okay.
I've always loved about books.
Yeah.
I always thought they're epic, and they're interesting because of the plethora, right, of viewpoints.
Right.
What do you recommend? I mean, in your own books compared to when people are going on writing, do you feel that Jim's way of going about that, which I think I haven't seen really anyone else that's, I mean, I'm sure there are some, but he's attempted something that I don't think is really well done.
No, it's really, really hard to do. The only person I've seen do it as well is George R. R. Martin. And I honestly don't like his books as much because they're just too brutal for me. Right. I like more hope. He's a genius of a writer, but I want to read books where I don't get to the end and say, oh, you did it to me again. You killed off everyone I love. Now
is that the innovation? I mean, do you think that was an innovation of his, or do you think that's
Yes, the big thing that George R. R. Martin, his biggest innovation, I think, is his ability to make it feel real, to juggle a huge number of viewpoints from the beginning, and to be like brilliantly brutal and evil to his readers. And he's really, really good at that. But getting back to the original question, for aspiring writers yourselves, I suggest doing what Robert Jordan did, which is the Eye of the World. Correct me if I'm wrong, but we really get Rand and Perrin and a little Egwene, no, a little Nynaeve. Yeah, you get 3 viewpoints for the first book. He doesn't have 22 viewpoints in his first book. He has 3 because you're still getting used to the world. And once you're really used to the world, then to add complexity and to add depth, instead of showing new world elements, which he still does some, he transitions to showing new people's views on this world. And so I highly recommend sticking to a couple of viewpoints in the first book, and then adding more and more as you feel comfortable writing. So if you're going to write a big, long series, yes, lots of viewpoints. But there are some authors who, even professional authors that I like, try to do a huge number of viewpoints in the first book, and I don't like those books very much. You don't have enough time to really get to know and love someone. And so, yeah.
Is it Erickson or someone else?
It's not Erickson. Erickson, it's someone else, and I don't want to mention their name. But Erickson has a little bit of this problem, in that you don't get time to really get to know anyone, and then he'll kill them off. And that Erickson really is a really good writer. I don't think Erickson can be discounted. I think he's in Jim's same tradition and doing a very good job of it. And it's one of the few people who is doing a good job of it and making it their own. But yeah, I personally feel that's what I would suggest to new writers is pick 3 main characters, tell a story about them, and then the next book add a few more. And if you want to expand it to as many as Jim might, you know, it's hard to say Jim had too many because Jim did something fantastic, but it's really hard to keep track of people in the Wheel of Time. It's very, very hard, and it's probably the biggest barrier to people starting the series or jumping into the series is picking up a book, and even if you've read them in the past, when the new one comes out, remembering who everyone is. I mean, it took me forever to remember who Morgaze was, you know, when she became a main character. Like, I remembered it, but to remember, you know, what her plots were, what her motivations were, all of these things. And that's why you have why so many of us reread the whole series every time a book came out, which is a big commitment of time. And if someone is not as brilliant as Robert Jordan, then I'm not going to do that for their series, which means that I'm going to probably read their books and then not be able to follow them and not be wanting to go put all the effort into starting over again. Anyway, so yeah, right here.
I have 2 quick questions.
Okay.
The first one was, you had mentioned on your blog you had written a little over 400,000
yes.
words, you know, before the split actually occurred. You said you kind of cut out, the Gathering Storm about 250,000,
yeah.
and then added some scenes.
I actually I cut it at 250, and then I went to them and said I was wrong. I need about 300. It ended up at 283, and then I added about 30,000 of scenes, and then I did a natural cut. It's always good to cut cut down. I try to cut down by 5 to 10% on everything I write, just because extra language. It's not that I'm cutting any scenes, it's that I'm repeating myself too many times and things like that, shrinking the language. And so that brought it back down under 300,000. And then Harriet asked for a couple more scenes, which brought it back up over. And now I'm doing some more of her line edits, which is slowly shrinking it down again, but it's going to end up right at about 300.
And I was just wondering, like you said, sort of cut it out, so the writing process, for writing part 2, is it all jumbled? Do you have to go back and kind of reconstruct it?
Yeah, I'll show you what I did.
Actually start.
We're running a little low on time, but you guys will find this interesting. When I approached it, since I saw this natural division when I was looking at the notes, this and this, and this isn't exactly it because there's a little bit more than this, but it's easier to present this way. And what these all are is, this is a group of characters who are united either in geographic location or in spirit, in that they're thinking about each other, their fates are intertwined, these sorts of things. If you think really hard, you can probably think about what these 4 divisions are and figure them out on your own. I sat down and said, okay, the best way for me to do this is there's so much to keep track of, to dump everything that this group of characters needs into my RAM of my head, and write all of this, and then dump it out, and reload with all of this, and write this. And so essentially, I started writing 4 different books. And so what I did is I started and went like that, and wrote that one straight through. And then I got done with that, and I wrote this one straight through. And then I got done with that, and I actually did all of this one, and was about ready to start this one. And this is when they decided they just needed to break it, because that alone was 450,000 words. And that's where they said it needs to be broken. And so what I did is, I took, like I said, big chunks of these, and then a little bit of this. And then I wrote a little bit of this, so that we would have some of each of these. And what that means is, however, this one got all rebalanced, because though I took that much of it, some of it was from different places in this, because I didn't want to start a plot arc and then not give you a resolution to it. And so instead, I was trying to essentially treat this like, let's tie up stuff from Knife of Dreams, and maybe just give a hint of what's going to happen in here. And so there are little pieces that got cut out and turned into better scenes for this character. And the same thing kind of for this one, though this one was more cohesive, because I knew what I was doing when I wrote it. because it had already been decided that we were probably going to split it then. And so this viewpoint right here is really scatterbrained, because I was writing this one, intending it all to be one book, and to be between jumping back and forth between all of these, staggered. And so I was expecting to just narratively, you want to have, as a book goes, you want to have a rhythm to the book. That there are not all of the action scenes from all of the viewpoints happening at once. That it's, action, rest, some fun, some of this, so that there's a nice, and that they're all steadily building to a big explosive climax. And so this was balanced to be offset by these. But now it has to be offset by this one, along with these two things here. Which means this one is in complete need of an overhaul to make it work narratively. Nothing that happens is going to change, but some of the order will need to change, and some of the, the tone of various scenes will need to change to make it feel like a book and not just wholes and pieces. And so this needs a whole lot of work. And this is 150,000, well, not really 100. This is more like 100,000 words with 50,000 of this. And that's what I have written right now. Is that not much? No, it's a little less than that. So, yeah, that's going to take a lot of work. It's like I'm a little bit ahead from where I was last time I was starting one of these, but I'm not as far ahead as it seems by as much as it's done because of how much reworking this is going to take. Okay. Last question. Okay.
Well, I was like, I know you can't give out away anything major, but
yeah.
We've got 7 months. Is there something you can give us to tie this up?
Oh boy. One thing, something that is in this book, is that what you want to know? What is in this book that you can look forward to? Well, there's a scene about a farmer. Let's see. I have said that Bella appears in the book.
Bella's not my main character.
Yeah. Okay. What do you think, Alan? Can I give him something? Do you think it'd be okay if I mentioned one of the viewpoint groups? Or do you think I should hold off on that?
Well, 7 months is a long time.
No, hold on.
We're hearing a lot of
You can probably tell them about how Bella was drawn and quartered.
Okay, yeah. She survives the last battle. So I really think that I should hold off on that. Just there are too many people who don't want to hear in the room, and out of respect for them, I don't want to release too much. If you study the prologue, when and if it comes out early, which I think it's going to, you can see what the major plot arcs are going to be because I used the pieces of the prologue from Jim as foundations for that. So, yeah.
And about the prologue.
Yeah.
Jim's prologues are always 100 pages, and it says that 50 pages will be in book 1 and 50 in book 2.
Yes, yeah.
So if the prologue comes out, will we only get the
You'll probably only get the book 1 prologue, and it's 25,000 words or something like that. So it's still huge. I mean, but it's not as huge as some of them because they've dipped up to 40,000. So anyway, we probably have to be done. I have an appointment, and followed by me leaving. I'm flying out at 3 o'clock. So.
Wow.
I was asking one comment, and then we can give you the proper goodbye here. The vendors, they asked me to make this comment. The vendors came and they were kind of secluded a little bit during the, they're not over here. We don't really see them much. And if we want them back next year, we want these guys to keep coming and spend the time to sit there and if you can go by, make a pass, take a look at what's there.
Pick up a
if
card.
you find something,
I saw some nice stuff over there. Some of the stuff I'm obviously not going to be buying is a $1,200 eye of the world. I just don't have the cash for my kids, so it's not going to happen. But go take a look. And
the sword guy is particularly cool, but also the shawls and stuff.
Yeah, there's some nice stuff over there. So
The performers that were here last night, they're over there. They're selling their CDs and stuff.
Oh, go buy a CD. Yeah.
So anyways, otherwise, thank you very much for coming. And,
I'm happy to sign find them. And I'm going to try and come back to DragonCon. So hopefully I'll be able to say a little bit more at DragonCon because the time is getting closer. And hopefully the prologue will even be out by then.